For over 700 years, the samurai shaped the history of Japan, not only through battlefields but through bureaucracy, diplomacy, philosophy, and politics. Though often remembered for their armor, swords, and duels, the full story of the samurai reveals far more, a complex evolution from provincial fighters to aristocratic administrators, from ruthless warlords to national symbols. Who were the samurai, really? And how did a class of warriors rise to dominate a nation, only to vanish in a matter of decades? This is the entire story of the samurai. Let's begin. Long before the image of the armored warrior came to define Japanese history, the roots of the samurai were quietly forming in the shadows of a declining imperial court. To understand the samurai, we must begin not with swords and honor, but with shifting power, rural provinces, and the slow unraveling of centralized control in ancient Japan. In the early centuries of Japanese history, political power was concentrated in the imperial court, located in Heian, modern-day Kyoto. The emperor, supported by an elite class of aristocrats, presided over a Chinese-inspired system of government. This structure, known as the Ritsuryo system, aimed to organize society through codified law, land distribution, and a state-run bureaucracy. Originally adopted in the 7th and 8th centuries, this system was modeled after the Tang dynasty's centralized government in China. At first, this form of governance gave the imperial court a firm grip over Japan. The emperor's officials were responsible for taxation, land surveys, and legal administration. In theory, all land belonged to the state, and the court assigned rice-producing fields to farmers in exchange for labor and tax payments. But theory and practice began to diverge as time went on. By the 8th and 9th centuries, the central government faced growing difficulties in managing the outlying provinces. Japan's geography, rugged, mountainous, and dotted with distant islands, made direct rule from the capital challenging. Many provincial areas were far removed from the reach of court-appointed officials. The court's influence began to fade, and with it, the strict legal system it tried to enforce. As the court's power declined, influential aristocratic families began to claim more autonomy in their own regions. These families, many of whom descended from the imperial line, started to accumulate private landholdings known as shuen. These estates were often exempt from taxation and legal oversight. Over time, they grew into powerful, semi-independent domains managed by local elites rather than imperial bureaucrats. To defend these private lands, aristocrats began hiring warriors. These early bushi, or fighting men, were often local toughs familiar with the terrain and skilled in archery and horseback riding. Many came from lesser noble families or rural clans with military experience. At first, they were not yet a distinct social class, but their importance quickly grew. In response to rising banditry and frontier disputes, local landholders needed reliable protection. The court also began relying on provincial warriors to deal with unrest, especially in remote regions like the Northeast. These early warriors were called up to subdue rebellions, suppress rival clans, or collect taxes by force when peaceful means failed. As the imperial army weakened, private military strength became more valuable. The transformation of Japan from a bureaucratic to a military society was not sudden. But by the late 9th century, the foundations of samurai culture were taking shape. The bushi were no longer just muscle for hire. They were becoming hereditary warriors with their own values, networks, and aspirations. The imperial court, increasingly ceremonial in function, had little choice but to recognize their rising influence. The Heian period, which spanned from the late 8th to the late 12th century, is often remembered for its courtly refinement and artistic achievement. But beneath the surface, power was slowly shifting away from court nobles in silk robes to armored men on horseback. While aristocrats composed poetry and conducted elaborate rituals in Heian, real control over much of the countryside rested in the hands of those who could wield force. Among the families that began to dominate this emerging warrior class were the Taira and Minamoto. Both traced their lineage to imperial ancestors, but unlike their courtly cousins, they carved out their status through military service and provincial governance. These clans were often dispatched to deal with local conflicts or lead frontier campaigns, especially in the Tohoku region, where resistance to central authority remained strong. By the 10th century, figures like Taira no Masakado and Minamoto no Tsunemoto were making their mark as military leaders with semi-independent power bases. Masakado, in particular, became notorious after launching a rebellion in the mid-10th century, declaring himself new emperor in the east. Though ultimately defeated, his actions demonstrated how far samurai ambition had come. The court could no longer ignore the growing threat and potential of the warrior class. This period also saw the gradual development of warrior customs and values. Loyalty to one's lord, personal bravery, and martial skill were increasingly prized. While there was no formal code of Bushido yet, the seeds of samurai ethics were beginning to form. Military households passed down traditions, and alliances between warrior families were cemented through marriage, service, and mutual defense. The rise of the samurai was not a planned event. It was the product of a slow breakdown in central authority, the emergence of local power centers, and the practical needs of landholders in an insecure world. As the imperial court faded into ceremonial irrelevance, the samurai stepped into the vacuum, not yet as rulers, but as enforcers, protectors, and power brokers. What began as a fragmented response to lawlessness and weak governance would, within a few generations, become the dominant force in Japanese politics. The age of the aristocratic official was ending. The age of the warrior had begun. By the end of the 11th century, Japan was a divided landscape of aristocratic landowners, increasingly independent warrior families, and an imperial court struggling to retain symbolic authority. While the court in Heian remained the ceremonial heart of the nation, real power was shifting toward regional military elites. Among them, two families rose to particular prominence, the Taira and the Minamoto. Their rivalry would erupt into a civil war that would not only reshape Japan's political structure, but also confirm the samurai as the ruling class. The Taira clan, also known as the Heiki, had gained significant power through military service and shrewd political maneuvering. Taira no Kiyomori, one of the most influential figures of the 12th century, successfully advanced his family's position within the imperial court. Unlike previous warriors who remained on the fringes of aristocratic society, Kiyomori broke barriers by marrying into the imperial family and placing his grandson on the throne as Emperor Antoku. In doing so, he blurred the line between military and noble classes. Under Kiyomori's leadership, the Taira clan reached the peak of its influence. He held the title of Daijo Daijin, Grand Minister of State, the highest rank in the court bureaucracy. But his rise came at a cost. Many court nobles and rival warrior families viewed his dominance with suspicion and resentment. Chief among these were the Minamoto, or Genji, who had been largely suppressed after a failed rebellion decades earlier. They were now poised to return with vengeance. The spark that ignited the Genpei War came in the year 1180, when Emperor Go-Shirakawa, frustrated with Taira control, secretly encouraged Minamoto no Yoritomo, son of the executed Minamoto no Yoshitomo, to rise against the Taira. The call to arms resonated across the country, drawing in numerous warrior clans who had long chafed under the Taira's grip. Yoritomo, exiled as a child and raised in the eastern provinces, was ready. Yoritomo was not the only Minamoto to take up the cause. His half-brother, Minamoto no Yoshitsune, emerged as one of the most celebrated military leaders in Japanese history. While Yoritomo focused on consolidating power and building alliances in the east, Yoshitsune led the Minamoto forces in a series of stunning victories against the Taira across western Japan. The Genpei War, which lasted from the year 1180 to 1185, was not a single campaign, but a series of battles, shifting allegiances, and strategic maneuvers. One of the early turning points came at the Battle of Uji in 1180, when Minamoto forces attempted to block Taira advances by tearing up the bridge across the Uji River. Though they were ultimately pushed back, the battle signaled the start of open conflict. Over the next few years, the Minamoto steadily gained ground. Their victories were aided not only by military skill, but also by local dissatisfaction with Taira rule. Many regional warlords known as Gozoku switched sides, preferring the leadership of the Minamoto over the increasingly autocratic Taira regime. Perhaps the most decisive engagement of the war came in the year 1184 at the Battle of Ichinotani. Yoshitsune orchestrated a daring flanking maneuver, leading a small force through treacherous mountain terrain to attack the Taira from behind. The result was a rout. The Taira were driven from their stronghold near modern-day Kobe, and their morale began to crumble. The final blow came at the naval battle of Dan no Ura in the year 1185. Taking place in the narrow straits of the Inland Sea, this battle pitted the remaining Taira forces against the Minamoto navy. During the fight, tides turned both literally and figuratively. The Taira fleet, initially in a favorable position, was undone by shifting currents and betrayal from within. One of their commanders defected mid-battle, revealing their battle plans to the Minamoto. The consequences were catastrophic for the Taira. Many were killed, and others, including women and children of noble lineage, drowned themselves to avoid capture. Among them was the young Emperor Antoku, who was carried into the sea by his grandmother rather than fall into enemy hands. With his death, the Taira dynasty ended. The Minamoto emerged victorious, but the war's conclusion raised new questions. Would power simply return to the imperial court, or would a new system emerge? Minamoto no Yoritomo answered this by establishing a military government, what would later be known as a bakufu, based in Kamakura, far from the imperial capital. In doing so, he fundamentally altered the structure of Japanese governance. The creation of the Kamakura Shogunate in the year 1192 marked the beginning of samurai rule in Japan. Although the emperor remained as a symbolic figurehead in Kyoto, actual political authority rested with the shogun, a military leader who governed through networks of vassals and land stewards. The office of shogun was not merely a title, it institutionalized warrior control over the state. Yoritomo's genius lay not only in battlefield success, but also in administrative innovation. He appointed military governors, or shugo, to oversee provinces and land stewards, or jito, to manage estates and collect taxes. These positions were often hereditary and answered directly to the shogunate. This system allowed the Minamoto to maintain control over the provinces without relying on the weakening structures of the old court. Though Yoritomo had vanquished his enemies and reshaped the nation, his rule was not without difficulty. His relationship with his brother Yoshitsune, once his most trusted general, soured quickly. Suspicious of Yoshitsune's popularity and possible ambitions, Yoritomo ordered his death. Yoshitsune fled and was eventually cornered and forced to take his own life. This fratricidal tragedy became a staple of later Japanese literature and theater, casting Yoshitsune as a tragic hero and Yoritomo as a cold strategist. By the end of the 12th century, Japan had been transformed. The imperial court still performed ceremonies and rituals, but true power belonged to the samurai. The Genpei War had not only ended Taira dominance, but had also dismantled the illusion of centralized aristocratic rule. The sword had replaced the brush as the primary instrument of governance. This shift had deep cultural implications as well. The values associated with the samurai, loyalty, martial skill, and duty, became embedded in Japanese identity. Though still evolving, these ideals would shape centuries of thought and practice, influencing everything from political behavior to literature. The Genpei War was more than a conflict between two clans. It was a defining moment in the making of medieval Japan. It confirmed that military strength, rather than noble birth alone, would determine political legitimacy. It elevated the samurai from regional enforcers to national rulers. With the fall of the Taira clan and the triumph of Minamoto no Yoritomo, a new era began in Japanese history. For the first time, political authority no longer rested in the hands of the aristocratic court in Kyoto, but in the hands of a military government established in Kamakura. The Kamakura Shogunate, founded at the end of the 12th century, marked the formal beginning of samurai rule over Japan. This was not merely a transfer of power. It was the construction of an entirely new political system, shaped by the needs, values, and interests of the warrior class. Minamoto no Yoritomo's rise had been secured through force, But he knew that lasting control would require more than battlefield victories. In the year 1192, he was officially appointed Sei Taishogun, commonly referred to as shogun by the imperial court. This title, meaning barbarian subduing generalissimo, had been used before in specific military campaigns, but Yoritomo's use of it as a permanent political role was unprecedented. It marked the beginning of military government, or bakufu, which would endure in different forms for the next 7 centuries. The new government operated from Kamakura, a coastal city far from the imperial capital of Kyoto. This geographic distance was intentional. It allowed the shogunate to avoid the influence of court nobles and to operate independently while still recognizing the emperor's ceremonial authority. In this way, a dual system of governance emerged. The emperor and his court continued to perform traditional rituals, but real power rested with the shogun and his samurai administrators. One of Yoritomo's key innovations was the creation of a parallel administrative structure. He appointed shugo, or military governors, to oversee provinces and enforce order. These officials were responsible for military defense, policing, and supervising local warriors. In addition, Yoritomo introduced the position of jito, land stewards, who managed estates, collected taxes, and ensured loyalty to the shogunate. These roles were often granted to loyal vassals and became hereditary, further entrenching the samurai class. This system allowed the Kamakura government to exert control over vast areas of Japan without a large central bureaucracy. It was practical, flexible, and tailored to the realities of a decentralized feudal society. The shogunate's authority relied not on written law alone, but on personal loyalty, military service, and the distribution of land rights, a structure that aligned closely with samurai values. After Yoritomo's death in the year 1199, power passed not to another Minamoto leader, but to his widow's family, the Hojo clan. Hojo Masako, Yoritomo's wife, became a central figure in this transition. Known as the nun shogun for her religious vows and political influence, she played a decisive role in shaping the succession. Her father, Hojo Tokimasa, became the first shikken, or regent, for the shogun. The Hojo regency system effectively sidelined the shoguns themselves, who became figureheads. The real authority lay with the regents, who controlled appointments, policies, and legal decisions. This created a layered hierarchy. The emperor held symbolic authority, the shogun was the nominal military leader, and the Hojo regents governed in practice. While complex, this structure provided a stable framework for over a century. The Kamakura period also saw important developments in legal and institutional frameworks. In the year 1232, the shogunate issued the Joei Shikimoku, a legal code that codified rules for land disputes, inheritance, and vassal conduct. Unlike the earlier court-based legal systems, this code reflected the values of the warrior class: fairness in land division, loyalty to lords, and the resolution of conflicts through clear, enforceable rules. Religion and philosophy also played an important role during this era. Pure Land Buddhism gained popularity among the common people, while Zen Buddhism began to influence the samurai elite. Zen's emphasis on discipline, meditation, and personal insight resonated with warrior ideals. Its influence would grow stronger in later centuries, shaping samurai attitudes toward life, death, and duty. Culturally, the Kamakura period marked a departure from the refined aesthetics of the Heian court. While poetry and literature remained important, there was a new emphasis on realism, morality, and impermanence. Works such as the Hojoki and the Tale of the Heike reflected the harshness and unpredictability of the age. These texts offered meditations on suffering, ambition, and the fall of great houses, lessons deeply relevant to a society shaped by war. The shogunate also maintained a careful relationship with the imperial court. While the emperor's role was largely ceremonial, the legitimacy of the shogunate depended on maintaining the appearance of imperial approval. The Kamakura regime never abolished the monarchy. Instead, it allowed the court to continue its rituals while reserving political authority for the samurai government. This balance helped prevent open rebellion, but tensions would simmer beneath the surface. By the early 13th century, the Kamakura Shogunate had established itself as the dominant force in Japan. It governed through a combination of military strength, administrative innovation, and decentralized control. The samurai, once provincial enforcers, were now the ruling class, managing land, dispensing justice, and shaping the nation's future. But the very system that gave the shogunate strength also left it vulnerable. Its reliance on vassal loyalty, inheritance of office, and limited direct control meant that maintaining unity required constant vigilance. These vulnerabilities would become clear in the next major test of samurai rule. A threat not from internal rivals, but from the greatest empire the world had ever seen. In the 13th century, the Mongol Empire, under the leadership of Kublai Khan, had become the most powerful military force in the known world. Stretching from the plains of Central Asia to the heart of Eastern Europe and the coasts of China, the Mongols had overwhelmed even the mightiest armies through their speed, discipline, and brutality. Japan, a small island nation across the sea from the Asian mainland, had never faced such a formidable threat. When the Mongols turned their gaze toward Japan, the Kamakura Shogunate and the samurai found themselves confronting a completely different kind of warfare. One that would test not only their military strength, but the very foundations of their government. Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, had established the Yuan dynasty in China by conquering the Song dynasty in the south. His ambition did not stop at the Chinese mainland. Seeking to extend his influence throughout East Asia, he demanded submission from nearby kingdoms, including Korea, Vietnam, and Japan. In the year 1268, he sent the first in a series of diplomatic missions to Japan, expecting the Japanese court to acknowledge him as their suzerain. The emissaries were received, but their demands were ignored. The Kamakura Shogunate, led by the Hojo regents, viewed the Mongol request as a threat to Japanese sovereignty. Submitting to a foreign emperor, especially one who had gained power through conquest, was unthinkable. When repeated Mongol envoys arrived over the next several years, they were met with silence or outright dismissal. By the year 1274, Kublai Khan had run out of patience. The first invasion came in the year 1274. The Mongol forces set sail from the Korean peninsula, consisting of a coalition of Mongol, Chinese, and Korean troops. Estimates of their number vary, but most historians agree that the invading force totaled over 20,000 men. The fleet crossed the Tsushima Strait and landed on the islands of Tsushima and Iki before advancing to Kyushu, the southernmost of Japan's 4 main islands. For the samurai, this encounter was a shock. Mongol warfare was organized, tactical, and reliant on massed infantry, archers, and coordinated charges. In contrast, Japanese samurai still practiced a style of combat focused on individual bravery, mounted archery, and single combat. During battles, it was customary for samurai to announce their lineage and challenge enemies one-on-one. But the Mongols did not wait for formalities. They attacked in formations, used drums to coordinate movement, and deployed explosive projectiles, early forms of gunpowder bombs. The defenders were overwhelmed. The Mongols captured parts of northern Kyushu, including Hakata Bay. Japanese resistance was fierce, but poorly coordinated and lacking in unified command. However, the Mongol forces never established a strong foothold. After only a few days of fighting, a sudden and violent storm struck the area. Japanese accounts describe it as a typhoon that smashed ships, drowned soldiers, and scattered the Mongol fleet. The survivors retreated, and the first invasion ended as abruptly as it had begun. In the wake of this miraculous victory, many in Japan saw divine intervention at work. The storm was interpreted as a gift from the gods, a divine wind, or kamikaze, sent to protect the nation. This term would echo through Japanese history for centuries, taking on new meanings in later eras. But in the 13th century, it became a symbol of national destiny and divine favor. Despite the apparent triumph, the Kamakura government understood that the Mongols were not defeated. Preparations for a second invasion began almost immediately. Defensive walls were constructed along vulnerable coastlines, particularly around Hakata Bay. These walls were made of stone and earth, stretching for kilometers, designed to prevent enemy landings. Garrisons were strengthened, arms were stockpiled, and local samurai were mobilized for long-term defense. Kublai Khan, undeterred by the initial failure, launched a second invasion in the year 1281. This time, the force was even larger. Historians estimate that more than 100,000 troops were assembled, sailing from both Korea and southern China. The fleet numbered thousands of ships, making it one of the largest seaborne invasions in pre-modern history. The Mongol strategy was to converge the fleets near Kyushu and overwhelm Japanese defenses with sheer numbers. However, delays and logistical problems plagued the operation from the start. The Korean fleet arrived earlier than the southern Chinese fleet, leading to disjointed operations. Japanese defenders used the opportunity to launch aggressive raids on Mongol ships anchored offshore, employing small boats to attack at night. Once again, after weeks of stalemate, a powerful typhoon struck. The Mongol fleet, trapped in the shallow waters near the coast, was devastated. Thousands of ships were destroyed, and tens of thousands of soldiers perished. Survivors were either killed by Japanese forces or captured. This second failure effectively ended Mongol ambitions to conquer Japan. The two invasions had far-reaching consequences for both Japan and the Kamakura Shogunate. On the surface, the successful defense reinforced the legitimacy of the samurai government. The narrative of divine protection and samurai valor became deeply embedded in national identity. However, the reality behind the scenes was more complex. The military mobilization had placed enormous strain on the Kamakura government. Thousands of samurai had been called to service, leaving their lands unattended. Moreover, unlike civil wars or domestic rebellions, defending against a foreign invasion offered no material rewards. There were no conquered lands to distribute, no wealth seized from defeated enemies. Many samurai expected compensation for their efforts, but the shogunate lacked the resources to satisfy them. This created growing dissatisfaction among the warrior class. The bonds of loyalty that had sustained the shogunate began to weaken. At the same time, the costs of maintaining coastal defenses and a standing army further drained the government's resources. The Hojo regents, who had ruled for generations through careful administration and military control, now faced growing unrest and declining revenues. The psychological impact of the invasions was also significant. Japan had faced annihilation and survived, not through negotiation or overwhelming strength, but through nature's fury. The idea of kamikaze gave the Japanese people a sense of spiritual protection, but it also masked the vulnerabilities of their political system. The samurai had defended their homeland bravely, but the structural weaknesses exposed by the Mongol threat would not be forgotten. Meanwhile, the Mongol Empire, though still vast, began to show signs of internal strain. The failure to conquer Japan marked one of Kublai Khan's few major defeats. While he continued to rule in China, his ability to project power across East Asia diminished. For Japan, the Mongol invasions had ended, but the consequences were still unfolding. In the years that followed, the Kamakura Shogunate grew more isolated and rigid. The government focused on defense and control, but unrest simmered in the provinces. Ambitious figures within both the imperial court and the warrior class began to question the legitimacy and effectiveness of the Hojo regime. The Mongol invasions had left the Kamakura Shogunate militarily triumphant, but financially and politically strained. As the 14th century began, the Hojo regents faced a growing crisis of legitimacy. Their centralized authority over the provinces had weakened, and their failure to reward samurai who had defended the realm against foreign threat caused deep resentment. Into this climate of dissatisfaction stepped an unlikely challenger, an emperor determined to reclaim lost power. His name was Emperor Go-Daigo, and his rebellion would bring about the fall of the Kamakura regime and plunge Japan into a new era of conflict. The Kamakura government had long maintained a delicate balance with the imperial court in Kyoto. Though the court was largely ceremonial, it remained a symbol of historical continuity and divine rule. Yet within the cloistered walls of Kyoto, emperors had not forgotten the political power once held by their ancestors. Some retained ambitions of restoring direct rule, though such efforts had failed for centuries. Emperor Go-Daigo was different. He was not content with being a figurehead. He believed it was his destiny to return imperial rule to its former prominence. Go-Daigo ascended to the throne in the early 14th century, at a time when the authority of the Hojo regency was faltering. The shogunate had become increasingly rigid, dependent on outdated systems of control and fearful of internal dissent. At the same time, ambitious provincial warriors were looking for opportunities to rise beyond the constraints of Kamakura's hierarchy. Go-Daigo saw this discontent as an opening. In secret, he began building alliances with dissatisfied samurai and court nobles, laying the groundwork for rebellion. The first attempt came in the year 1331. Go-Daigo sought to rally support from warrior families in the western provinces and launched an open challenge to the Kamakura government. However, the uprising was premature and poorly coordinated. The Hojo responded swiftly, capturing the emperor and exiling him to the Oki Islands in the Sea of Japan. But even in exile, Go-Daigo remained defiant. Meanwhile, unrest continued to spread. One of the key figures to emerge during this period was Ashikaga Takauji, a general sent by the Kamakura Shogunate to suppress the rebellion. Takauji came from a branch of the Minamoto clan and had a long history of service to the shogunate. But when he was ordered to fight Go-Daigo's loyalists, he made a bold and unexpected decision. He turned against the Hojo. Takauji's betrayal marked a crucial turning point. He seized Kyoto, declared support for Go-Daigo, and invited the emperor to return from exile. Around the same time, another powerful warlord, Nita Yoshisada, led a successful campaign against Kamakura itself. In the year 1333, the city fell. The Hojo regents were either killed or forced to commit suicide, and the Kamakura Shogunate, Japan's first military government, came to an end after nearly 1.5 centuries of rule. With the fall of Kamakura, Go-Daigo returned to Kyoto in triumph and launched what became known as the Kemu Restoration. His goal was clear: to restore direct imperial rule, dismantle the warrior government, and centralize power once more in the imperial court. At first, this restoration seemed to fulfill the dreams of centuries past. The emperor issued new laws, reorganized the bureaucracy, and attempted to reassert control over land and titles. But the Kemu Restoration soon ran into serious problems. Go-Daigo had underestimated the extent to which the samurai class had become essential to governance. Many warriors who had supported his return expected rewards, land, titles, and political influence. Instead, Go-Daigo favored court nobles and reinstated civil aristocrats in key positions. This alienated the very warriors who had made his return possible. Ashikaga Takauji, who had played a decisive role in the shogunate's downfall, was among those dissatisfied with the new regime. Feeling that his contributions had been overlooked and alarmed by the court's attempts to restore old aristocratic privileges, Takauji broke with the emperor. In 1335, he raised an army against Go-Daigo, claiming that the emperor had failed to govern justly. A new civil war erupted between imperial loyalists and Takauji's forces. The conflict was brutal and chaotic, with shifting alliances and battles across multiple provinces. In the end, Ashikaga Takauji emerged victorious. He captured Kyoto and installed a rival emperor, supported by his own military faction. Go-Daigo fled south and established a rival court in Yoshino. This schism, known as the Northern and Southern Courts Period, or Nanboku-cho, would last for over half a century. In the year 1338, Ashikaga Takauji declared himself shogun, founding the Ashikaga, or Muromachi Shogunate. This marked the beginning of a new military regime, one that sought to learn from the failures of both the Kamakura government and the Kemu Restoration. While still relying on the samurai class for control, Takauji's shogunate tried to balance power between warrior lords and the imperial court, though this balance would remain fragile. The brief Kemu Restoration revealed deep structural shifts in Japanese society. It demonstrated that the court alone could no longer govern without the cooperation of the samurai. The warrior class had become not only the muscle of the state, but also its administrators, governors, and judges. Efforts to marginalize them were doomed to fail. At the same time, the Restoration showed the limits of imperial legitimacy. Go-Daigo had relied on divine descent to assert his right to rule, but in practice, power depended on military support. The fall of the Kamakura Shogunate and the failure of the Kemu Restoration were not just political events. They marked the end of one phase of samurai rule and the beginning of another. Japan had entered a new and more complex era. The dream of restoring the old imperial order had come and gone. Now, the challenge was managing a fractured nation where multiple courts claimed legitimacy and powerful warlords pursued their own ambitions. With the collapse of the Kamakura Shogunate and the failure of the Kemu Restoration, Japan entered yet another era of warrior rule, but this time under different conditions. Ashikaga Takauji's seizure of power in the mid-14th century marked the beginning of the Ashikaga, or Muromachi, Shogunate. While Takauji succeeded in establishing a new military government, the political landscape he inherited was far less stable than that of his Kamakura predecessors. The Ashikaga Shogunate would oversee both a period of cultural brilliance and a descent into prolonged civil strife, revealing just how fragile centralized warrior rule could be. The Muromachi period, named after the district in Kyoto, where the Ashikaga family built their headquarters, began in the year 1338, when Ashikaga Takauji formally assumed the title of shogun. Unlike the Kamakura Bakufu, which operated far from the imperial court, the Ashikaga placed their government close to the emperor, physically and symbolically. This was a deliberate choice, reflecting Takauji's initial alliance with the imperial court and his attempt to derive legitimacy from it, even as he placed military authority firmly in samurai hands. But the unity of the nation remained elusive. Emperor Go-Daigo, who had been overthrown by Takauji, established a rival court in Yoshino, south of Kyoto. This marked the beginning of the Northern and Southern Courts period, or Nanboku-cho, during which two separate imperial lines claimed legitimacy. The Southern Court, led by Go-Daigo and his descendants, insisted on the unbroken sacred lineage of emperors. The Northern Court, supported by the Ashikaga Shogunate, installed emperors who were essentially under shogunal control. This dual monarchy caused both symbolic and practical confusion. Local warlords were forced to choose sides, and the split became a prolonged struggle for legitimacy. Though the Northern Court held the political and military advantage for most of the conflict, the Southern Court retained a strong ideological appeal. The war dragged on for several decades until a partial reconciliation in the late 14th century finally brought the two courts under a single imperial line, though by then the emperor's role had become almost entirely ceremonial. During this time, the real power in Japan belonged to regional warlords known as daimyo, many of whom owed only nominal allegiance to the Ashikaga Shogunate. These lords held large territories, maintained private armies, and often acted as semi-independent rulers. The shogunate's ability to enforce national policy was weak. Ashikaga Takauji had relied heavily on provincial warriors to defeat his enemies, and after taking power, he had little choice but to reward them with land and titles, further decentralizing authority. Successive Ashikaga shoguns attempted to assert more control, with varying degrees of success. Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, who ruled in the late 14th century, was perhaps the most powerful and effective of the line. He managed to negotiate the reunification of the imperial courts in the year 1392 and stabilized the capital. Yoshimitsu also strengthened diplomatic relations with Ming China, accepting a tributary relationship in exchange for regulated trade. Though controversial, this move brought economic benefits and demonstrated the shogunate's ability to operate on an international stage. Yoshimitsu was also a patron of the arts, helping to initiate what became known as the Kitayama Cultural Renaissance. Under his sponsorship, architecture, painting, theater, and garden design flourished. The iconic Kinkaku-ji, or Golden Pavilion, was built during his rule and remains a symbol of classical Japanese aesthetics. Zen Buddhism continued to spread among the warrior elite, influencing everything from ink painting to tea ceremonies. In cultural terms, the Muromachi period marked a high point in medieval Japanese refinement. But behind the cultural achievements and brief political stability lay deep structural weaknesses. The Ashikaga Shogunate never developed the administrative capacity of the Kamakura government. There was no centralized taxation system, and the shogunate relied on personal loyalty rather than institutional authority. As powerful daimyo grew more autonomous, the bonds holding the country together began to fray. These tensions erupted into full-scale civil war with the outbreak of the Ronin War in the year 1467. Ostensibly a succession dispute between two branches of the Ashikaga family, the conflict quickly escalated into a national power struggle. Major daimyo aligned themselves with rival factions, turning Kyoto into a battlefield. Over the next decade, the capital was devastated by urban warfare, fires, and looting. Many of its aristocratic families fled, and the authority of the shogunate collapsed. The consequences of the Ronin War were profound. It marked the beginning of the Sengoku, or Warring States, period, a century of fragmentation, shifting alliances, and constant conflict among regional lords. Central authority, whether from the emperor or the shogun, became largely irrelevant. Power was now determined by military strength, land control, and the ability to command loyal retainers. During this period, the traditional hierarchies of Japanese society began to shift. Ambitious warlords, regardless of birth, could rise through battlefield success. Samurai loyal to these warlords served in increasingly professional capacities, not just as warriors, but as castle governors, strategists, and political advisors. Warfare became more organized and large-scale, with the rise of permanent armies and fortified castle towns. The Ashikaga Shogunate, though still existing in name, had lost almost all practical authority by the end of the 15th century. Shoguns became figureheads, often manipulated or ignored by the real power holders in the provinces. Even Kyoto, the heart of the imperial and shogunal system, was divided among rival factions. In retrospect, the Ashikaga era was a time of both brilliance and breakdown. The cultural legacy of Zen-inspired aesthetics, no theater, ink painting, and architectural harmony remains influential to this day. But politically, the failure to centralize power or maintain loyalty among the daimyo set the stage for a century of internal warfare. The fragility of the Muromachi order reveals an important truth about samurai rule. Military dominance alone could not guarantee stability. Without strong institutions and cohesive leadership, even the most successful warrior governments were vulnerable to collapse. The Ashikaga Shogunate may have worn the trappings of authority, but it lacked the structure to contain the ambitions of the regional lords it had empowered. As Japan descended into political fragmentation and military conflict during the Muromachi period, a quieter but equally transformative revolution was taking place. One that would define the samurai not only as warriors, but as bearers of culture, discipline, and philosophy. This transformation was deeply tied to the spread of Zen Buddhism, a religious tradition that, though imported from China, found a unique and lasting home among Japan's warrior class. Zen Buddhism, or Chan in Chinese, had been introduced to Japan earlier through monastic exchanges with the Song dynasty. However, it was during the 14th and 15th centuries, particularly under the Ashikaga Shogunate, that Zen truly took root. The military rulers of this period, especially Ashikaga Yoshimitsu and his successors, not only tolerated Zen, but actively patronized its temples, abbots, and teachings. What began as a religious practice evolved into a wide-reaching cultural influence that reshaped the values and aesthetics of the samurai elite. Zen's appeal to the samurai was not accidental. Unlike the more esoteric rituals of earlier Buddhist schools, Zen emphasized direct experience, personal discipline, and self-realization through meditation. It downplayed elaborate doctrine in favor of silence, simplicity, and mental clarity. For warriors constantly facing the prospect of death and the burdens of duty, these teachings provided a spiritual framework that resonated with their harsh realities. One of Zen's core practices was zazen, or seated meditation. This method of stilling the mind and focusing awareness became an essential part of samurai mental training. In a world of political uncertainty and sudden violence, Zen offered an internal stability that transcended external chaos. Monks often taught that fear of death could be overcome not by avoidance, but by accepting impermanence as a fundamental truth. This concept deeply influenced the samurai's evolving philosophy. Death was no longer something to be feared. It became a test of readiness, honor, and detachment. In Zen, the moment of death could be the moment of enlightenment. For the warrior, it became a moment to affirm loyalty, integrity, and self-control. Zen also shaped the visual and material culture of the samurai. The austere beauty of Zen temples, gardens, and calligraphy reflected a minimalist sensibility that rejected ornament in favor of essence. Samurai began to adopt these values in their homes, attire, and conduct. Ink painting, known as sumi-e, with its emphasis on brushstroke, empty space, and spontaneity, became a favored art form. These paintings often featured solitary landscapes, mountains shrouded in mist, or a single gnarled pine, symbols of endurance and quiet strength. Architecture, too, reflected this aesthetic shift. Zen-inspired temples, such as Rionji and Tenryuji, were constructed with clean lines, natural materials, and an emphasis on harmony with the surrounding environment. Rock gardens, known as karasansui, symbolized islands, rivers, and mountains through abstract stone arrangements, inviting contemplation and introspection. The tea ceremony, or chanoyu, also emerged during this period as a central cultural practice tied to Zen. While tea drinking had existed in Japan for centuries, it was Zen monks who elevated it into a ritual of mindfulness and simplicity. Under the influence of masters such as Murata Juko and later Senno Rikyu, the tea ceremony became an expression of wabi-sabi, an aesthetic of humility, imperfection, and transience. Samurai lords sponsored and participated in these ceremonies, not as idle pleasures, but as disciplines of refinement and mental control. A proper tea gathering required attentiveness, restraint, and appreciation of subtle detail, qualities that mirrored the mental clarity needed on the battlefield. Literature, too, took on a new tone. Warrior monks and samurai thinkers began writing essays and reflections that combined Zen insights with martial experience. The language was often spare, direct, and focused on the nature of action, time, and self. These writings circulated among the educated elite and contributed to a distinct samurai identity that merged martial obligation with spiritual contemplation. Zen's influence even extended into military training. Samurai instructors began to emphasize not only technique but mindset. The ideal warrior was not only skilled in combat but also unshakable in focus, able to strike without hesitation and die without fear. This integration of physical skill and mental clarity laid the groundwork for the samurai code of conduct that would later be formalized under the name Bushido. It is important to note that Zen was not the exclusive religion of the samurai class. Other forms of Buddhism, such as Pure Land and Nichiren, continued to thrive among the common people and lower-ranking warriors. Shinto beliefs, centered on kami and ancestral worship, also remained deeply embedded in Japanese culture. But Zen occupied a special place in the upper echelons of samurai society. Its quiet intensity mirrored the idealized image of the disciplined, detached warrior. The Ashikaga Shogunate, though politically weak, became a hub of cultural experimentation and exchange. Monks traveled between China and Japan, bringing with them not only spiritual teachings, but new styles of painting, architecture, and garden design. Temples functioned as centers of learning, diplomacy, and artistic innovation. Monasteries such as Kenninji and Myoshinji became influential beyond their religious roles, acting as cultural beacons during times of political instability. This flourishing of Zen culture, however, did not prevent Japan's descent into prolonged civil conflict. As the Muromachi government weakened, regional warlords gained more autonomy, leading to the outbreak of the Onin War and the chaos that followed. Yet even in this era of widespread violence, the values and aesthetics shaped by Zen continued to guide the conduct and self-perception of the warrior class. By the time Japan entered the Sengoku period, the figure of the samurai had become more than a warrior for hire. He was increasingly seen as a man of cultivation, discipline, and internal strength. The sword was still his tool, but so was the brush. He was expected to embody loyalty, readiness for death, and an appreciation for simplicity and impermanence. Zen had not created the samurai, but it had refined him. It had given form to an identity that transcended brute force. In a land torn by war, the fusion of sword and silence offered a powerful image, one that would define the samurai not only in their own time, but in the centuries to come. By the middle of the 15th century, Japan stood at a crossroads. The Ashikaga Shogunate, already weakened by internal rivalries and the rise of powerful regional warlords, was losing its ability to command authority across the realm. Tensions among the warrior class were high and old alliances were fraying. What followed was one of the most destructive conflicts in medieval Japanese history, the Ronin War. Though it began as a dispute over succession, the war unleashed decades of chaos that would shatter the last remnants of centralized power and usher in an age of civil war. The origins of the conflict can be traced to the succession crisis within the Ashikaga Shogunate in the year 1467. At the center of the crisis was Ashikaga Yoshimasa, the 8th shogun. Yoshimasa had no heir for most of his rule, and his leadership had long been criticized as indecisive and culturally indulgent. A patron of the arts rather than a strong military leader, he devoted much of his attention to architecture, tea ceremony, and garden design, pursuits that would later define the Higashiyama cultural aesthetic. But his lack of political focus left a vacuum. In the absence of a direct successor, a power struggle emerged between two potential claimants: Yoshimasa's younger brother, Ashikaga Yoshimi, and his own infant son, Yoshihisa, who was born late in his life. This division created a broader rift among the great military families, particularly between two of the most powerful clans, the Hosokawa and the Yamana. The Hosokawa clan supported Yoshimi, believing that an experienced adult heir would provide stable leadership. The Yamana clan backed the infant Yoshihisa, aiming to maintain influence over a child shogun. These rivalries quickly escalated beyond court politics and turned into military preparations. As both factions began to mobilize their forces in Kyoto, it became clear that this dispute would not be resolved through diplomacy. In the summer of the year 1467, open conflict broke out in the capital. The city of Kyoto became the central battlefield, and the Ronin War began. What followed was not a brief skirmish, but a drawn-out and devastating civil war that lasted for over a decade. Much of the fighting took place within the city itself, leading to widespread destruction. Entire districts of Kyoto were burned to the ground, noble residences were looted, and countless cultural treasures were lost in the flames. The war quickly lost any clear political objective. While it had begun over the succession issue, the factions involved multiplied, and alliances shifted constantly. Many daimyo used the conflict as an excuse to settle old scores, expand their territories, or test the strength of their rivals. The Ashikaga Shogunate, lacking both will and resources, failed to control the escalating violence. Yoshimasa, the shogun at the center of the original crisis, retired to his villa and left governance to collapse around him. The most devastating aspect of the Ronin War was not just its immediate destruction, but its long-term consequences. By the time the fighting subsided in the year 1477, the political landscape of Japan had fundamentally changed. The central government had become irrelevant. The imperial court had been reduced to ceremonial formality, and the shogunate was no longer capable of enforcing its authority. In the aftermath, Japan entered the Sengoku Period, a century-long era of fragmented rule, regional warfare, and near-constant conflict. The word Sengoku means warring states, a term borrowed from Chinese history, and it accurately describes the state of Japan at the time. Dozens of regional warlords, or daimyo, now ruled independently in their own territories. Each maintained private armies of samurai, administered local laws, and collected taxes without interference from Kyoto. This decentralization of power was unprecedented. While earlier periods of conflict had been centered around competing imperial or shogunal claims, the Sengoku era was defined by a complete absence of national leadership. Political legitimacy became secondary to military strength. A daimyo's authority depended on his ability to defend his land and command the loyalty of his retainers. Social mobility, at least among warriors, increased, and ambitious men could rise through martial skill and strategic alliances. The breakdown of central authority also led to the proliferation of new castle towns across Japan. These fortified centers became administrative and military hubs for local lords. As the threat of warfare grew constant, the architecture of governance shifted. Castles were no longer merely symbolic. They became essential instruments of survival and control. The cultural impact of the Ronin War was equally significant. Many of Kyoto's aristocrats, monks, and artists fled the capital during the fighting, taking their knowledge and traditions with them to provincial domains. This helped to spread classical culture to the countryside, where local rulers began to sponsor temples, schools, and artistic production. Ironically, the destruction of the cultural heart of Japan contributed to the cultural development of its periphery. Yet, despite the emergence of regional powers, the chaos of the post-Ronin years produced immense suffering. Peasants bore the brunt of the violence as armies marched through farmlands, seized supplies, and conscripted labor. Banditry and lawlessness increased. Villages fortified themselves and formed self-defense leagues known as Iki, some of which would grow into significant military and political forces in their own right. Religious institutions also became militarized during this time. Some Buddhist sects, particularly the Jodo Shinshu, organized large armed communities called Iko-Iki that resisted the rule of local warlords and challenged both shogunal and imperial authority. These movements blended spiritual teachings with political resistance, further complicating the fractured landscape of Sengoku Japan. By the end of the 15th century, the legacy of the Ronin War was clear. The centralized structures of the past had collapsed, and Japan had become a patchwork of competing domains. The Ashikaga shoguns still held their titles in Kyoto, but their influence was purely symbolic. Real power lay with those who could command armies, defend territory, and build alliances. This was a new age for the samurai, no longer merely retainers or enforcers. They were now the political actors and military architects of Japan's future. In the absence of imperial or shogunal leadership, it would be up to individual daimyo to impose order, if they could. Following the collapse of centralized authority in the wake of the Ronin War, Japan entered one of the most violent and transformative periods in its history, the Sengoku Period. Literally meaning Age of the Warring States, this era stretched for over a century and was defined by the fragmentation of power, unending warfare, and the relentless ambition of samurai warlords vying for dominance. It was an age without a true ruler, where the sword, not the law, dictated authority. The Sengoku period began informally in the late 15th century, once the Ashikaga shogunate had effectively lost all capacity to govern. The emperor remained a symbolic figure, the shogun an empty title. What filled the void was a patchwork of local rule, with powerful daimyo establishing autonomous domains. These lords built fortified castles, trained professional armies, and administered justice as independent rulers. In effect, Japan had devolved into dozens of competing states, each operating like a miniature kingdom. At the heart of this transformation was the rise of castle-centered governance. In earlier centuries, Japanese military elites had resided in Kyoto or held court in provincial estates, but the dangers of constant warfare demanded new forms of defense and control. Castles became not only military strongholds, but also political centers. Surrounding these fortresses were growing castle towns, where merchants, artisans, and administrators lived under the protection of the ruling lord. These towns became the economic and administrative foundations of Sengoku rule. One of the defining features of the period was the militarization of society. Armies were no longer composed solely of elite samurai on horseback. Instead, large numbers of foot soldiers, known as ashigaru, were recruited from the peasant class, often trained and armed with spears and, increasingly, with firearms. These soldiers were organized into disciplined units, capable of coordinated attacks and prolonged campaigns. Warfare became more strategic, structured, and sustained. This period also witnessed significant technological and tactical innovations. The introduction of firearms, brought to Japan by Portuguese traders in the mid-16th century, revolutionized battle tactics. Though early matchlock guns were slow and cumbersome, Japanese smiths quickly improved upon the designs and mass-produced them for use in war. The use of volley fire and gun formations became standard practice among the most advanced armies. In the chaos of the Sengoku period, certain regional leaders began to distinguish themselves through military prowess, political acumen, and strategic vision. Among the most notable figures were Takeda Shingen, Uesugi Kenshin, and Date Masamune. Takeda Shingen, Lord of Kai Province, was renowned for his battlefield strategy and administrative reforms. He created a detailed legal code, maintained strict control over his vassals, and was respected even by his enemies. His cavalry tactics and innovative use of terrain made him one of the most feared warlords of his time. Uesugi Kenshin, his greatest rival, ruled Echigo Province and became known as the Dragon of Echigo. Kenshin was both a skilled general and a devout follower of Bishamonten, the Buddhist god of war. His legendary battles against Shingen, particularly the series of engagements at Kawanakajima, became emblematic of Sengoku-era warfare. Though neither man ever achieved national dominance, their rivalry symbolized the fierce competition that defined the age. Another key figure, Date Masamune, ruled in the northeast and was known for his charisma, military talent, and distinctive appearance. He lost an eye in battle and came to be known as the One-Eyed Dragon. Masamune expanded his territory aggressively and fostered trade and foreign relations, even sending an embassy to the Spanish court and the Vatican. Though he rose to prominence later in the Sengoku period, his ambition and vision exemplified the possibilities of power in a fractured Japan. What separated these daimyo from earlier generations of samurai was not just their military skill, but their capacity to govern. Many implemented land surveys, tax reforms, and legal systems to stabilize their domains. They built roads, encouraged commerce, and regulated currency within their territories. This shift towards state building marked an important evolution in samurai leadership. The most successful warlords were those who could combine martial power with administrative order. Religion also played a complex role during this time. While Zen Buddhism continued to influence the warrior class, other sects such as Jodo Shinshu spread rapidly among the peasantry. Some Buddhist institutions fielded armies of their own, particularly the Iko-Iki movements, which rejected samurai rule and defended their own fortified communities. These leagues clashed with many daimyo, especially those who sought to impose strict control over religious lands. In addition to Buddhism, Christianity made its first significant appearance in Japan during the Sengoku period. Portuguese Jesuit missionaries, beginning with Francis Xavier in the year 1549, introduced Christian teachings to Japanese audiences. In several domains, particularly those governed by daimyo interested in foreign trade, Christianity was welcomed. Converts included both peasants and high-ranking lords, who saw the new religion as a potential ally against Buddhist institutions or rival warlords. However, the presence of Christianity also introduced new tensions, both religious and political, that would grow in significance in the coming decades. The rise of foreign trade was another hallmark of this era. European ships brought firearms, textiles, and other goods to Japanese ports in exchange for silver, copper, and lacquerware. Japanese merchants, especially those in port cities such as Sakai and Nagasaki, grew wealthy and powerful, operating semi-independently from the daimyo. These merchants supplied armies with weapons, armor, and provisions, linking the war economy to a broader commercial network. Despite the violence and instability, the Sengoku period was not a cultural void. In fact, it was a time of artistic and intellectual creativity. The tea ceremony continued to develop under figures like Sen no Rikyu, emphasizing simplicity, discipline, and a Zen-influenced aesthetic. No theater, ink painting, and garden design also flourished under the patronage of warlords eager to display their refinement and legitimacy. By the late 16th century, the landscape of Japan had been fundamentally transformed. Dozens of independent domains operated like sovereign states. The authority of the Ashikaga Shogunate had completely collapsed, and even the emperor's symbolic role had been diminished. Yet amid the chaos, a new generation of leaders began to emerge. Men with the vision and resources to unite the fractured nation. As the Sengoku period reached its most chaotic heights, the dream of reunifying Japan under a single rule seemed nearly impossible. Decades of civil war, broken alliances, and shifting loyalties had shattered the land into a mosaic of independent and often hostile domains. Yet it was precisely in this climate of fragmentation that a new kind of leader emerged. One who would not only challenge the old order, but set the stage for a unified Japan. That leader was Oda Nobunaga. Born in the year 1534, Nobunaga was the son of a relatively minor daimyo in Owari province, located in central Honshu. His family controlled a modest domain, surrounded by stronger and more established rivals. From an early age, Nobunaga gained a reputation for eccentric behavior, unpredictable leadership, and an unorthodox style that alienated many of his retainers. Some considered him reckless. Others saw in him the traits of a visionary. Following his father's death, Nobunaga faced a succession crisis within his own clan. While other family members and retainers favored his more cautious brother, Nobunaga seized control through a combination of bold action and calculated intimidation. Once established as Lord of Owari, he wasted no time asserting dominance over his neighbors. Nobunaga's military campaigns quickly revealed his tactical brilliance and strategic ruthlessness. In the year 1560, at the Battle of Okehazama, he achieved one of the most celebrated victories in samurai history. Facing an invading force led by Imagawa Yoshimoto, whose army vastly outnumbered his own, Nobunaga launched a surprise attack during a rainstorm. The Imagawa camp, unprepared and overconfident, was thrown into chaos. Yoshimoto was killed in the assault, and Nobunaga's reputation as a military genius was secured. From that moment, Nobunaga's power expanded rapidly. He forged alliances, subdued rival clans, and incorporated conquered territories into his growing domain. Unlike many other daimyo of the period, Nobunaga did not rely solely on traditional samurai values. He embraced new technologies, welcomed foreign traders, and showed a pragmatic openness to ideas that served his political and military goals. Among his most notable innovations was the large-scale adoption of firearms. While guns had been introduced to Japan by the Portuguese decades earlier, many warlords remained skeptical of their effectiveness. Nobunaga, by contrast, recognized their potential early on. At the Battle of Nagashino in the year 1575, he deployed thousands of arquebusiers in coordinated volleys, protected by wooden stockades. The result was a devastating defeat for Takeda Katsuyori, whose famous cavalry charges were cut down by disciplined gunfire. Nobunaga also revolutionized the organization of his armies. He instituted more standardized training, logistics, and supply systems. His forces could move quickly and operate in complex, multi-stage campaigns. Rather than relying on the old feudal hierarchy, he promoted men based on merit and performance, creating a more efficient and loyal military structure. Beyond the battlefield, Nobunaga sought to undermine the power of institutions that stood in his way. Chief among these were the militant Buddhist sects that controlled large territories and maintained their own armies. In particular, the Iko-Iki, a network of warrior monks and peasant followers, posed a direct challenge to his authority. Their strongholds, such as Ishiyama Honganji and Mount Hiei, were fiercely defended and symbolically powerful. Nobunaga responded with uncompromising force. In the year 1571, he ordered the complete destruction of the Enryakuji temple complex on Mount Hiei, home to the powerful Tendai sect. His troops massacred thousands of monks and civilians, shocking contemporaries with the brutality of the campaign. Later, after prolonged sieges, He also defeated the Ikoiki at their other major centers of resistance. These actions were not simply acts of cruelty. They were calculated moves to break the autonomous power of religious institutions and consolidate control under his secular rule. Another feature of Nobunaga's rule was his approach to commerce and urbanization. He promoted free markets, known as Rakuichi Rakuza, which abolished guild monopolies and allowed open trade. By fostering castle towns as centers of economic activity, he attracted merchants and artisans, stimulating local economies and strengthening the financial foundations of his domain. This model would later be refined by his successors, but began under his administration. Nobunaga also maintained relations with European traders and missionaries, particularly the Jesuits. He allowed them to preach Christianity in his territory and even offered protection from Buddhist opposition. While he never converted himself, his tolerance was strategic. Christianity weakened the influence of rival religious sects and opened access to trade in firearms and goods. By the late 1570s, Nobunaga controlled a vast portion of central Japan, including Kyoto. He had installed Ashikaga Yoshiaki as a puppet shogun, only to depose him when he outlived his usefulness. With the shogunate abolished in all but name, Nobunaga exercised de facto control over the imperial court and government functions. His authority was not based on title, but on sheer power. Despite his many accomplishments, Nobunaga's ambition made him enemies. In the year 1582, while preparing for a campaign to eliminate the powerful Mori clan in western Japan, he was betrayed by one of his own generals, Akechi Mitsuhide. During a stop at Honnoji Temple in Kyoto, Nobunaga was ambushed and surrounded. Rather than be captured, he took his own life. His death sent shockwaves throughout the nation. Nobunaga's downfall was sudden, but his legacy endured. He had laid the foundation for national unification by defeating major rivals, modernizing military structures, and breaking the power of entrenched institutions. He did not live to complete the task, but the blueprint he left behind would guide those who followed him. The death of Oda Nobunaga in the year 1582 left a vacuum at the heart of Japan's unification process. Nobunaga had shattered the entrenched powers of religious militias and provincial rivals, laid the foundation of centralized governance, and extended military control over much of the country. Yet, he died before completing the work. It was Toyotomi Hideyoshi, his former sandal-bearer turned supreme commander, who would take up the mantle and finish what his master had begun. Hideyoshi's rise remains one of the most extraordinary in Japanese history. Born into a poor peasant family in Owari province, he had no warrior lineage or elite pedigree. His early service to Nobunaga was menial, but his loyalty, cunning, and administrative skill elevated him quickly through the ranks. By the time of Nobunaga's death, Hideyoshi was already a senior commander, known for his discipline in organizing troops and his uncanny ability to negotiate complex alliances. Following the betrayal at Honnoji, Hideyoshi moved swiftly to avenge Nobunaga. Within days, he confronted and defeated Akechi Mitsuhide at the Battle of Yamazaki. Mitsuhide was killed in retreat, and Hideyoshi emerged as the avenger of Nobunaga and, more importantly, as the de facto leader of the Oda faction. In the years that followed, Hideyoshi would outmaneuver other contenders for power, including members of the Oda family itself. By the mid-1580s, Hideyoshi had secured military and political control over central Japan. He won major victories against the Mori in the west and the Hojo in the east. After the siege of Odawara in the year 1590, the last major resistance was eliminated. From Kyushu in the south to the Kanto region in the east, the great daimyo submitted. While he never claimed the title of shogun due to his humble origins, Hideyoshi was granted the imperial title of Kampaku, imperial regent, and later Taiko, or retired regent. His rule was absolute in all but name. Unlike Nobunaga, whose authority was based primarily on military conquest, Hideyoshi sought to build lasting order through governance and social restructuring. He understood that force alone could not ensure stability in a country that had been divided for over a century. To this end, he embarked on a series of sweeping reforms designed to pacify the population, codify class divisions, and centralize power. One of his most famous and impactful policies was the katanagari, or sword hunt, issued in the year 1588. This edict prohibited all non-samurai classes, peasants, merchants, and monks, from owning weapons. Local officials were ordered to search villages and temples and confiscate any swords, spears, or other military equipment. The stated purpose was to prevent uprisings and to distinguish clearly between warriors and the rest of the population. The sword hunt had both practical and symbolic functions. Practically, it reduced the potential for rebellion by disarming those who might resist samurai rule. Symbolically, it reinforced a strict social hierarchy, cementing the samurai as the military class and removing the ambiguity that had defined the Sengoku era, when peasants often fought as ashigaru foot soldiers. This was part of a broader strategy to freeze the social order, an effort that would later be formalized under Tokugawa rule. Alongside the sword hunt, Hideyoshi implemented a policy of separation of the classes. People were forbidden from changing their social status or moving without official permission. Peasants were tied to their land, while samurai were required to live in castle towns under the watchful eyes of their lords. This system aimed to stabilize rural production and ensure loyalty to centralized authority. While oppressive in many respects, it succeeded in ending the free-for-all mobility that had characterized the Sengoku period. Hideyoshi also initiated national land surveys, known as Taiko Kenchi, which established the taxable value of each province based on rice production. These surveys enabled the state to standardize taxation and clarify land rights, reducing disputes among lords and strengthening administrative control. The land assessments became the foundation of political and economic management for the coming centuries. Religious policy under Hideyoshi was more complex. While he initially tolerated Christianity, even allowing Jesuit missionaries to operate freely, his attitude shifted in the late 1580s. Concerned by reports of European interference and suspicious of divided loyalties among Japanese converts, he issued an edict in the year 1587 banning Christian proselytizing and ordering the expulsion of missionaries. While not uniformly enforced at first, this marked the beginning of a more restrictive stance toward Christianity that would intensify under Tokugawa rule. Hideyoshi's ambitions, however, extended beyond Japan. In the early 1590s, he launched two massive invasions of the Korean peninsula, intending to use Korea as a stepping stone for a larger campaign into China. These wars, known as the Imjin Wars, were costly and ultimately unsuccessful. Though Japanese forces achieved early victories, they were eventually pushed back by a combination of Korean resistance, Ming Chinese intervention, and logistical difficulties. The Korean campaigns drained resources and exposed the limits of Japanese military expansion. More significantly, they demonstrated the challenge of projecting power beyond the archipelago at a time when domestic unity was still fragile. Hideyoshi's aggressive foreign policy puzzled even his closest allies and added strain to his legacy. In the final years of his life, Hideyoshi focused on ensuring the succession of his young son, Hideyori. Knowing that his son would be too young to rule alone, he created a council of 5 regents drawn from the most powerful daimyo, including Tokugawa Ieyasu. This arrangement was intended to preserve unity after his death. However, as with many such succession plans, it quickly unraveled. Toyotomi Hideyoshi died in the year 1598. His achievements were remarkable. He had unified the country, implemented comprehensive social reforms, stabilized the economy, and promoted culture. Yet his failure to establish a durable system of succession left the country once again on the brink of civil war. The power vacuum that followed would pit the Toyotomi loyalists against those who sought to establish a new order. Among them was Tokugawa Ieyasu, the most powerful of the regents and a cautious, calculating strategist who had long played a patient game of survival and advantage. The death of Toyotomi Hideyoshi in the year 1598 marked the end of an era. Although he had successfully unified Japan and imposed a rigid social and administrative order, The country was not yet politically stable. His heir, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, was still a child, and despite Hideyoshi's careful arrangements for a council of regents to govern in the interim, the balance of power was fragile from the outset. Among the 5 regents, one figure stood out not only in power but in ambition: Tokugawa Ieyasu. Tokugawa Ieyasu had long been a shrewd and patient player in the tumultuous world of Sengoku politics. A former ally of both Oda Nobunaga and Toyotomi Hideyoshi, he had survived numerous battles, betrayals, and shifting alliances. By the time of Hideyoshi's death, Ieyasu controlled vast and fertile territories in the eastern provinces, particularly around the Kanto region, where he had established Edo, later Tokyo, as his power base. In the years following Hideyoshi's death, tensions among the regents escalated. While the council was meant to collectively safeguard Hideyori's succession, it became clear that Tokugawa Ieyasu was consolidating power for himself. He strengthened ties with influential daimyo, secured strategic marriages, and carefully positioned his allies throughout the country. His growing influence alarmed other members of the Toyotomi camp, particularly Ishida Mitsunari, a senior bureaucrat and one of Hideyoshi's most loyal retainers. Mitsunari, though not a military man by background, was politically savvy and fiercely committed to preserving the Toyotomi legacy. He gathered a coalition of daimyo opposed to Tokugawa dominance, drawing support from powerful Western clans such as the Uesugi, Mori, and Shimazu. The opposing sides quickly organized into 2 camps: the Eastern Army under Tokugawa Ieyasu and the Western Army led by Ishida Mitsunari. In the autumn of the year 1600, both armies began maneuvering toward the decisive confrontation. The chosen battlefield was Sekigahara, a narrow plain in the central region of Mino Province. Strategically located between east and west, it offered clear terrain for deployment and was flanked by hills and forested ridges. Each side brought tens of thousands of troops, including samurai, ashigaru, and retainer forces, totaling well over 100,000 men combined. The Battle of Sekigahara began on the morning of the 21st day of the 9th lunar month. Heavy fog initially cloaked the battlefield, but once it lifted, Tokugawa's forces moved swiftly to engage. The initial clash was evenly matched, with both sides locked in intense combat. However, Tokugawa Ieyasu had prepared more than a simple head-on confrontation. In the weeks leading up to the battle, he had secretly negotiated with several of the Western Army's commanders, including Kobayakawa Hideaki, whose loyalties had long been in question. At a critical moment during the battle, Kobayakawa, stationed on a hill overlooking the battlefield, defected to Tokugawa's side and ordered his troops to charge the Western lines. This betrayal triggered a cascade of collapses within Mitsunari's ranks. Several other commanders who had been undecided or secretly aligned with Tokugawa followed suit, turning on their former allies. Surrounded and overwhelmed, the Western Army disintegrated. By midday, the battle was over. Ishida Mitsunari was captured days later while attempting to flee and was executed in Kyoto. Most of the remaining Western leaders were either killed, exiled, or stripped of their domains. Tokugawa Ieyasu now stood as the unchallenged master of Japan. The victory at Sekigahara was not merely a military triumph. It was the turning point that reshaped the political structure of the nation. In the years following the battle, Tokugawa systematically restructured the power dynamics of the realm. Loyal allies were rewarded with vast tracts of land, while defeated opponents were removed or relocated. The redistribution of territory ensured that the balance of power favored Ieyasu's supporters and placed critical provinces under Tokugawa control. In the year 1603, Tokugawa Ieyasu received the title of Sei Taishogun from the emperor, formally establishing the Tokugawa Shogunate. This marked the beginning of the Edo period, which would last for more than 2.5 centuries. Unlike previous military regimes, the Tokugawa Shogunate achieved unprecedented stability, prosperity, and longevity. It was not only the third shogunate in Japanese history, it was the most enduring and transformative. Ieyasu's governance philosophy was shaped by the lessons of previous centuries of conflict. Where earlier rulers had focused primarily on conquest and direct control, he emphasized balance, regulation, and long-term preservation of power. His system of rule, later refined by his successors, rested on three core pillars: the rigid stratification of society, the surveillance and control of the daimyo, and the ideological reinforcement of Tokugawa legitimacy. One of Ieyasu's most effective tools for maintaining order was the Sankin-kotai system, which required daimyo to maintain residences in Edo and to alternate their years of residence between their domains and the shogun's capital. This not only drained the financial resources of potential rivals, who had to maintain two households and travel with large retinues, but also acted as a de facto hostage system, since the daimyo's families remained in Edo even when the lords returned to their provinces. Ieyasu also implemented strict regulations on marriage alliances between daimyo, construction of castles, and military mobilization. All required shogunal approval. The overall effect was to contain the autonomy of the great lords while preserving the illusion of local rule. Beneath this tightly woven web of control, the Tokugawa government managed to suppress major rebellions and prevent the kind of factional violence that had defined the Sengoku period. Importantly, Ieyasu did not abolish the imperial court. Instead, he preserved the emperor's ceremonial role in Kyoto, using the institution as a source of traditional legitimacy while keeping it politically powerless. This subtle arrangement allowed the shogunate to rule without overtly challenging the divine authority of the throne. Tokugawa Ieyasu passed away in the year 1616, but his legacy lived on through his descendants. He had secured peace, reorganized society, and created institutions that would define the shape of Japanese governance for generations. His rise was not the work of a single battle alone, but the culmination of a lifetime of strategic patience, alliances, and adaptation. With the victory at Sekigahara and the founding of the Tokugawa Shogunate, the samurai entered a new phase of their history. No longer defined by constant warfare, they now became administrators, bureaucrats, and moral exemplars in a society that prized order above ambition. The age of blood and steel had not ended, but it had been transformed. With the Tokugawa Shogunate firmly established after the victory at Sekigahara and the formal appointment of Tokugawa Ieyasu as shogun, Japan entered a new era. The long years of civil war and political fragmentation gave way to a period of internal stability, economic growth, and relative isolation from foreign influence. This time is known as the Edo Period, named after the Tokugawa capital that would one day become modern-day Tokyo. For over 2.5 centuries, Japan would be ruled by the Tokugawa family, and during this era, the role of the samurai would undergo a profound transformation. For centuries, the samurai had defined themselves through warfare. They were warriors by class, training, and self-perception. Yet with Japan unified and the threat of civil war effectively extinguished, the very skills that had made the samurai class so powerful became increasingly unnecessary. As peace settled over the country, the samurai found themselves in a new position, not as battlefield commanders, but as bureaucrats, administrators, and moral exemplars. Tokugawa Ieyasu and his successors were well aware of the need to control the warrior class. They respected the samurai's importance as a stabilizing force, but they also feared the potential for rebellion if these men, trained for violence and loyal to regional lords, were left unchecked. To address this, the shogunate developed a rigid social hierarchy that placed the samurai at the top, but also tightly regulated their behavior. At the core of Tokugawa governance was the philosophy of Shi no Kosho, a four-tiered class system that placed samurai above peasants, artisans, and merchants. This structure reflected both Confucian ideals and practical political needs. The samurai were expected to serve as the governing class, administering justice, collecting taxes, and ensuring the implementation of shogunal policies throughout the provinces. In exchange for their services, they received stipends paid in rice, often calculated according to their family's status and prior service. Yet the samurai's elevated position came with strict expectations. They were forbidden from engaging in commerce or manual labor, which were seen as beneath their dignity. Their lives were to be devoted to loyalty, discipline, and public duty. Many samurai were assigned to domainal bureaucracies, working as record keepers, legal advisors, tax inspectors, or castle guards. In the major castle towns, such as Edo, Osaka, and Kyoto, they lived in designated districts and wore their swords more as a symbol of status than as a tool of war. This shift from warrior to administrator created tensions within the samurai class. Younger generations who had never seen battle were raised in an environment that emphasized etiquette, literacy, and adherence to protocol over martial skill. Samurai families began to place greater value on education, with boys studying Chinese classics, calligraphy, poetry, and the moral principles of Confucianism. Some samurai even became scholars, artists, or school teachers, contributing to the intellectual life of the Edo period. As time went on, the economic structure that supported the samurai began to show signs of strain. Stipends were fixed, based on the assumption of continued feudal obligations, but the economy itself was changing. A growing merchant class, operating outside the formal hierarchy, accumulated wealth through trade, finance, and production. While samurai were discouraged from participating in business, many secretly borrowed money from merchants to support their lifestyles, leading to widespread indebtedness. The contradiction was clear. The samurai remained socially superior, yet economically dependent on those beneath them. This tension would persist throughout the Edo period and become a recurring theme in literature, theater, and social commentary. In some cases, impoverished samurai took on teaching jobs or unofficial roles in commerce, blurring the boundaries between classes that the Tokugawa system had tried to enforce. Despite these changes, the samurai retained a central role in the political and cultural life of the nation. The ideals of Bushido, the so-called way of the warrior, were increasingly codified and romanticized during this time. While earlier periods had seen Bushido as a loose collection of values, the Edo period saw it take on a more formalized moral framework, influenced heavily by Neo-Confucian ethics. Loyalty to one's lord, filial piety, honor, restraint, and readiness to die for duty became central themes in samurai education and identity. The symbolic power of the sword also persisted. Although large-scale warfare was absent, the wearing of two swords, one long and one short, remained a defining mark of the samurai. Swordsmanship schools flourished, and martial arts continued to be practiced as a form of discipline and tradition. Yet increasingly, the sword served not as a weapon of war, but as a symbol of status and spiritual focus. Throughout the Edo period, the shogunate maintained close surveillance over the daimyo through the Sankinkotai system. By requiring lords to spend alternating years in Edo and to leave their families behind as a form of guarantee, the Tokugawa ensured that no regional power could easily mount a rebellion. This system also created a network of roads and communication lines that contributed to economic integration and cultural exchange between the provinces. The Tokugawa peace also enabled a flourishing of cultural life. Samurai were both patrons and participants in this growth. Theaters in Edo and Osaka offered kabuki performances that depicted both historical epics and contemporary social tensions. Woodblock prints, calligraphy, and poetry became widespread. While samurai continued to uphold the ideals of austerity and self-control, many also participated in the refined culture of the cities, attending tea gatherings, poetry circles, and no performances. Despite the outward stability, the underlying contradictions of Edo society persisted. By the 18th century, economic disparities within the samurai class had widened. Some families remained wealthy and influential, holding high-ranking posts in domainal administrations. Others fell into poverty, unable to maintain appearances on a stagnant stipend. The image of the struggling, unemployed, or indebted samurai became a literary archetype, evoking both sympathy and critique. Reform efforts were occasionally attempted by both the shogunate and individual domains, aimed at reducing corruption, controlling costs, and reinvigorating samurai discipline. Figures such as Yamaga Soko and later scholars like Arai Hakuseki sought to revive Bushido values and restore moral clarity to samurai governance. Yet, these reforms rarely addressed the structural economic imbalances that continued to erode the foundation of samurai life. By the end of the 18th century, the samurai had become a class caught between memory and modernity. They still held authority, carried swords, and upheld the legacy of a warrior past. But they now lived in a society defined by bureaucracy, peace, and a growing commercial economy. The battlefield had been replaced by the ledger and the ink brush. The katana, once wielded in war, now hung in homes as a symbol of virtue rather than necessity. As the Tokugawa period progressed and Japan remained largely at peace, the function of the samurai continued to evolve. No longer warriors in the field, most samurai had become bureaucrats, educators, and administrators, serving the needs of a highly structured and stratified society. With fewer opportunities for martial action, attention turned inward, toward philosophy, ethics, and identity. It was during this time that the concept of Bushido, the way of the warrior, began to be formalized, not as a practical guide to battlefield conduct, but as an idealized moral code that defined the spirit of the samurai in a peaceful age. The term Bushido itself was not widely used during the medieval period. In earlier centuries, warriors certainly adhered to values such as loyalty, courage, and honor, but these were understood informally and varied by clan, region, and circumstance. There was no single unified code. It was only during the Tokugawa peace, particularly from the late 17th century onward, that Bushido began to be articulated as a coherent philosophy shaped by Confucian thought, Zen Buddhist influences, and samurai tradition. One of the earliest and most influential figures in the intellectual development of Bushido was Yamaga Soko, a samurai philosopher active in the mid to late 17th century. A former student of Neo-Confucianism, Yamaga sought to define a moral role for the samurai in a time without war. He argued that the samurai should serve as moral exemplars for the rest of society, combining martial readiness with ethical cultivation. In his writings, he presented the samurai not merely as fighters, but as models of disciplined behavior, selflessness, and devotion to duty. Yamaga's interpretation of the samurai role reflected the realities of Tokugawa governance. The sword was no longer used to seize power or defend territory. It had become a symbol of restraint and personal refinement. To carry a sword in Edo, Japan, was to carry a heavy ethical responsibility. One's actions, speech, and demeanor had to reflect the highest ideals of honor, humility, and loyalty. Another voice that contributed to the evolving Bushido ethos was that of Kaibara Eken, a Neo-Confucian scholar who emphasized the importance of filial piety, social harmony, and proper conduct. While not a warrior himself, Kaibara's teachings had wide influence among the samurai class, particularly those serving in administrative and educational roles. His writings stressed the duty of the individual to uphold order within both the family and the state, reinforcing Tokugawa ideals of stability and hierarchy. By the early 18th century, these philosophical ideas were further crystallized in one of the most famous works ever written about samurai values, Hagakure, compiled by Tsurumoto Tashiro from conversations with the former samurai Yamamoto Tsunetomo. Though written in the early 18th century, Hagakure reflected a nostalgia for a more violent, heroic past. It presented the samurai as a man who must always be prepared to die, placing loyalty and self-sacrifice above all else. One of the most quoted lines from Hagakure is, "The way of the warrior is death." This stark statement was not a call for meaningless violence, but a reflection of a worldview in which the samurai must be ready at any moment to lay down his life for his lord. By accepting death in advance, the samurai could act decisively, without hesitation, fear, or selfishness. While Hagakure was not widely read at the time of its writing, it would later gain great influence, especially in the 20th century, when samurai ideals were revived and romanticized in new contexts. The process of mythologizing the samurai also took place in popular culture. Kabuki theater, Woodblock prints, and historical fiction increasingly depicted legendary warriors and dramatic tales of loyalty, revenge, and sacrifice. Many of these stories were set in earlier centuries, during the Genpei War or the Sengoku Period, offering audiences dramatic contrasts to the restrained and orderly life of the Edo era. One such tale that captured the imagination of the Tokugawa public was the story of the 47 Ronin, which would become a national legend. In the early 18th century, a group of former retainers avenged the death of their lord by killing the official responsible, after patiently waiting and plotting for over a year. Following the assassination, the men turned themselves in and were ordered to commit ritual suicide. Their actions were widely admired as the ultimate expression of loyalty and bushido. The tale was retold in countless plays, poems, and books, reinforcing the romantic image of the honorable samurai in a world that no longer required heroism. This period also saw the increasing codification of samurai etiquette and behavior. Domainal laws set out rules for dress, weapon carrying, interaction with commoners, and proper forms of address. The katana, once used in battle, now functioned as a ceremonial accessory and a marker of identity. Martial arts training continued, but more as a discipline of body and spirit than as preparation for war. Dojos flourished across the country, where swordsmanship, archery, and unarmed techniques were practiced as means of self-improvement. Yet not all samurai were able or willing to live up to the emerging ideals of Bushido. Some resented the strict codes, the bureaucratic routines, and the economic decline of their families. Others struggled with the tension between high moral expectations and the practical demands of everyday life. The ideal of the loyal, selfless warrior was deeply inspiring, but it also set an impossibly high standard for real individuals facing debt, political infighting, or personal disappointment. Despite these tensions, Bushido became the moral backbone of Tokugawa society. It was taught in samurai academies, referenced in official proclamations, and embedded in the way samurai were expected to carry themselves in both public and private life. It helped shape the expectations of behavior, not only for the samurai, but for all classes, as Tokugawa governance emphasized order, discipline, and moral hierarchy. Importantly, Bushido during this period was not static. Different domains interpreted it in different ways. Some emphasized Confucian orthodoxy, others Zen-inspired detachment, and still others a more militaristic ethos. But what united these interpretations was a shared sense that the samurai, though no longer active on the battlefield, were still the moral compass of the nation. By the end of the 18th century, Bushido had become a powerful symbol, one that helped maintain social order and gave meaning to a class whose original function had largely disappeared. It was not simply a reflection of historical practice, but a cultural construction that drew upon the past to provide guidance for the present. In the early years of the 18th century, during a time of peace, regulation, and bureaucratic formality under the Tokugawa Shogunate, a single event reignited the ancient values of the warrior code and captivated the imagination of an entire nation. This was the story of the 47 Ronin, masterless samurai, who avenged their lord's death in an act that many viewed as the ultimate expression of Bushido, the samurai code of loyalty and honor. Though it unfolded in a time without war, this incident would become one of the most enduring legends of samurai virtue and a national parable of duty, sacrifice, and justice. The story begins in the imperial city of Kyoto in the year 1701. At the heart of the event was a young daimyo named Asano Naganori, lord of the Akko domain in western Japan. Asano was a minor lord, but he held the important ceremonial duty of receiving and hosting imperial envoys on behalf of the shogunate at Edo Castle. To prepare for this role, he was assigned to receive instruction in court etiquette from an experienced and powerful official named Kira Yoshinaka. Kira was a court functionary of high standing, known for his connections and rigid sense of protocol. According to later accounts, many of which have been shaped by drama and literature, Kira expected lavish gifts and bribes from those he instructed, a practice not uncommon among officials of the time. Asano, however, was either unwilling or unaware of such expectations. Tension grew between the two men, reportedly fueled by insults, humiliation, and perhaps a mutual disdain rooted in status and pride. Eventually, that tension reached a breaking point. On a spring day in Edo Castle, Asano, provoked beyond his limit, drew his sword and struck Kira in the face. Though Kira survived, Tokugawa law forbade the use of weapons within the shogun's palace under any circumstances. Asano's assault, regardless of motive, was considered an unambiguous breach of decorum and law. The punishment was swift and severe. Asano was ordered to commit seppuku, ritual suicide, that very day. His lands were confiscated, his household disbanded, and his samurai retainers made masterless. These Ronin were left without employment, income, or legal standing. The incident sent shockwaves through Edo and the entire country. To many, Asano's punishment appeared lawful but harsh. To his retainers, it was a dishonor that demanded redress. Among these retainers was Oishi Yoshio, the chief counselor of the Asano household. A seasoned and respected samurai, Oishi took it upon himself to uphold his lord's legacy. He and his fellow retainers believed that Kira, whose behavior had allegedly provoked Asano's outburst, bore moral, if not legal, responsibility for the tragedy. However, they faced a dilemma. The Tokugawa government had explicitly banned any form of retaliation, and any act of private vengeance would be considered rebellion. Rather than act impulsively, Oishi and the other loyal retainers dispersed and waited. Over the next year, they lived as if they had accepted their fate. Oishi, in particular, went to great lengths to appear dissolute, frequenting drinking establishments and living a life of apparent idleness in Kyoto. Some believed he had abandoned the cause entirely, but this deception was deliberate. The former retainers were waiting for the right moment, watching Kira's movements and carefully planning their next steps. In the 12th month of the year 1702, nearly 2 years after Asano's death, the 47 Ronin reassembled in Edo. Under Oishi's leadership, they launched a coordinated attack on Kira's residence during the early hours of the morning. Despite its size and security, the mansion was overwhelmed. The Ronin fought with precision and discipline, sparing women and children and minimizing unnecessary bloodshed. After a thorough search, they found Kira hiding in a storage room and executed him. Having completed their mission, the Ronin did not flee. Instead, they marched through the streets of Edo to the Sengoku Temple, where Asano was buried. There, they laid Kira's severed head before their master's grave, an act symbolizing the fulfillment of their loyalty and duty. They then turned themselves in to the authorities. The Tokugawa Shogunate now faced a profound moral and political dilemma. On one hand, the Ronin had clearly violated the law by taking justice into their own hands. On the other, their actions resonated deeply with the ideals of loyalty, sacrifice, and moral integrity. Public opinion overwhelmingly supported the Ronin, who were seen as heroes who had restored their master's honor at the cost of their own lives. After extended deliberation, the shogunate made its decision. The 47 Ronin were ordered to commit seppuku, a death sentence, but one carried out with dignity and in accordance with samurai tradition. This allowed them to die as honorable warriors rather than criminals. The order was carried out on the 4th day of the 2nd month in the year 1703. Their graves, located beside that of their lord at Sengoku-ji, became a site of national pilgrimage. The story of the 47 Ronin quickly spread throughout Japan. Plays, poems, and stories dramatized their actions, often adding embellishments and emotional detail. The tale, often referred to as Chushingura, became a national epic, retold in countless kabuki and bunraku performances. It captured the imagination of a society grappling with the contradictions of peace and warrior identity. What made the tale so powerful was its moral complexity. The Ronin had broken the law, but in doing so, they had upheld a higher code. They acted in defiance of the state, yet in complete loyalty to their master. They rejected personal gain, embraced hardship, and chose death over compromise. In an age when the samurai class was being absorbed into the structures of administration and etiquette, the story offered a reminder of an ideal, loyalty unto death, that transcended legal and political convenience. The 47 Ronin became symbols of Bushido in its purest form. Their story influenced generations of thinkers, artists, and political leaders. It provided a model for what it meant to be a true samurai, not in battle, but in moral resolve. At a time when many samurai were burdened by debt, routine, and questions of identity, the Ronin offered a vision of courage, unity, and unshakable purpose. Their legacy would only grow in the centuries to come, especially in modern times when the samurai ideal was revived as a tool of national identity. But within the context of the Tokugawa period, their story marked a rare convergence of historical event and moral drama. It demonstrated that even in a tightly controlled society, the ancient values of the warrior class could still ignite powerful emotions and inspire collective memory. By the late 18th century, the Tokugawa Shogunate had ruled Japan for over 2 centuries. The long peace brought by the Tokugawa system had transformed society in countless ways, economically, culturally, and politically. Yet, beneath the surface of this apparent stability, tensions were building. For the samurai class in particular, the very peace they had helped enforce was slowly rendering them obsolete. What had once been a warrior elite was now becoming a struggling bureaucratic caste, increasingly out of touch with the changing realities of Japanese life. The rigid Tokugawa class system had placed the samurai at the top of society, above peasants, artisans, and merchants. But by the late Edo period, this hierarchy was no longer aligned with economic reality. Merchants, originally placed at the bottom of the system, had grown immensely wealthy through trade, finance, and industry. They funded commercial networks that stretched across the archipelago, managed large-scale distribution of rice and goods, and even loaned money to the samurai. In contrast, most samurai lived on fixed stipends paid in rice, a system that had not changed with inflation or rising living costs. As prices rose, the real value of these stipends declined. Many samurai, unable to make ends meet, fell into debt. Some secretly engaged in commerce, despite official prohibitions, while others sought low-paying teaching or clerical positions. Their economic difficulties eroded the dignity of their social status and sowed widespread discontent within the class. The divide between samurai ideals and everyday life grew sharper. These were men raised on stories of honor, loyalty, and martial discipline, yet their days were filled with paperwork, protocol, and poverty. For younger samurai who had never seen combat and had little prospect of advancement, the warrior identity felt increasingly hollow. In urban centers such as Edo and Osaka, disaffected samurai gathered in study groups and literary societies, searching for meaning in a society that no longer seemed to need them. Some responded to this sense of decline by turning to scholarship and moral reform. Thinkers like Aizawa Seishisai and Motoori Norinaga began to critique the Tokugawa order and explore ideas rooted in Japanese tradition rather than Chinese Confucianism. Aizawa, writing in the early 19th century, warned of internal corruption and external threats, calling for a spiritual revival based on loyalty to the emperor. Motoori focused on native Japanese texts and Shinto beliefs, seeking to restore a sense of national identity independent of foreign philosophical systems. These intellectual movements, kokugaku, or national learning, signaled a subtle but growing dissatisfaction with Tokugawa rule. They were not revolutionary in the modern sense, but they questioned the legitimacy of a shogunate that had failed to adapt. For some samurai, especially those in lower ranks, this discontent led to calls for reform and renewal. For others, it fueled radical nationalism and dreams of restoring imperial authority. The economic crisis worsened in the 19th century. Natural disasters, crop failures, and mismanagement led to repeated famines, most notably the Great Tenpo famine in the 1830s. These crises exposed the inability of the shogunate to respond effectively. Public unrest increased, and even samurai joined protests against rising taxes and declining living conditions. In some domains, local lords implemented their own reforms, seeking to modernize agriculture, encourage industry, and ease the burden on retainers. These efforts had mixed results, but they highlighted the decentralization of authority in a supposedly unified system. In cultural life, the late Edo period was vibrant and expressive, even as it revealed the contradictions of the age. Samurai continued to participate in the arts, often as patrons or practitioners of painting, poetry, and the tea ceremony. But the world of popular culture, ukiyo-e prints, kabuki theater, and comedic storytelling was increasingly shaped by commoners. Many works subtly satirized the outdated pretensions of the samurai, portraying them as bumbling, impoverished, or caught in the grip of rigid codes that no longer applied. The rise of the chonin, or urban merchant class, was central to this cultural shift. Their wealth and patronage created a new center of gravity in Japanese society. While the samurai still wielded official authority, they often depended on the financial resources and business acumen of the very class they were supposed to look down upon. Some samurai sought alliances through marriage or patronage, further blurring the lines between class roles. One notable feature of the late Edo period was the growing tension between appearance and reality. Samurai still wore their two swords, still bowed with authority, and still invoked the language of loyalty and honor. But behind the facade, many lived lives of quiet desperation, working in side occupations or living off the charity of relatives. The ideal of the samurai remained potent, but fewer and fewer could live up to it. Despite these difficulties, the Tokugawa system did not collapse from within. Rather, its final challenge would come from without. By the middle of the 19th century, Western powers were expanding into Asia, using naval strength and diplomatic pressure to force open markets. Japan, which had maintained a policy of limited foreign contact for over 2 centuries, now faced the prospect of external intervention. The arrival of foreign ships, particularly those of the United States under Commodore Perry, would soon expose the vulnerability of the Tokugawa regime and spark a national crisis. But even before this moment, many samurai were already questioning their future. Some saw foreign technology as an opportunity to modernize and revitalize the warrior spirit. Others feared that foreign ideas would erode traditional values. Across the country, domainal schools began experimenting with Western science and military tactics, anticipating a world that would soon demand more than swords and scrolls. In this atmosphere of anxiety and anticipation, the identity of the samurai reached a turning point. Were they to remain guardians of a fading order, or could they become leaders in a new age? Could Bushido be reconciled with modern warfare and industrial progress? These were questions that no longer had easy answers. For over 2 centuries, Japan had maintained a policy of strict national seclusion under the Tokugawa Shogunate. Known as sakoku, this policy permitted only limited foreign trade, primarily through Dutch and Chinese merchants confined to the port of Nagasaki, and forbade Japanese citizens from traveling abroad. This isolation had shielded the country from the disruptive influences of colonialism and global conflict, allowing for internal stability and cultural development. But by the mid-19th century, the world was changing, and Japan could no longer remain untouched. The key turning point came with the arrival of Commodore Matthew Perry of the United States Navy in the year 1853. Commanding a squadron of black-hulled steamships, Perry anchored in Edo Bay, near the present-day city of Tokyo, and delivered a letter from President Millard Fillmore to the Tokugawa authorities. The letter demanded that Japan open its ports to American ships for trade and resupply. It also carried an implicit threat, backed by the imposing display of naval power. For the Tokugawa Shogunate, Perry's arrival was a profound shock. The sight of steam-powered warships, larger, faster, and more technologically advanced than anything in Japan's fleet, underscored the country's vulnerability. The shogunate, already weakened by internal dissent and financial strain, faced a dilemma. To reject Perry's demands risked war. To accept them threatened to undermine the very foundations of Tokugawa authority. Rather than respond immediately, the shogunate requested time to deliberate. Perry departed but promised to return, True to his word, he returned the following year, this time with an even larger fleet. Under pressure, the Tokugawa government signed the Treaty of Kanagawa in 1854. This agreement opened two ports, Shimoda and Hakodate, to American ships, ensured the humane treatment of shipwrecked sailors, and established diplomatic relations between Japan and the United States. Though limited in scope, the treaty marked the end of Sakoku. It was soon followed by similar treaties with Britain, Russia, the Netherlands, and France. These agreements, known as the unequal treaties, granted foreign powers extraterritorial rights and low import duties, creating a sense of humiliation among many Japanese. For the samurai class in particular, the treaties represented a betrayal of national sovereignty and a failure of the shogunate to protect the realm. The political consequences were immediate. The Tokugawa Shogunate, already facing mounting criticism from within, began to fracture. Opposition grew from multiple directions: reformist daimyo, disillusioned samurai, and imperial loyalists. Many rallied around the slogan, "Sano Joy." Revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. Though vague in practice, this phrase captured the growing sentiment that Japan needed to restore imperial rule and resist Western encroachment. Among the most prominent figures in this emerging movement was Sakamoto Ryoma, a visionary samurai from the Tosa domain. Though initially anti-foreign, Ryoma came to believe that Japan must modernize if it were to survive. He played a crucial role in brokering an alliance between two powerful domains, Satsuma and Choshu, that would ultimately lead the charge against the Tokugawa regime. Meanwhile, the samurai class as a whole was deeply divided. Some supported the shogunate, believing that reform within the existing system was still possible. Others embraced the idea of restoring the emperor as a symbol of unity and national revival. Many young samurai, especially from lower-ranking families in reformist domains, began studying Western science, engineering, and military tactics. They saw in modernization not a rejection of Bushido, but a new way to serve the nation with discipline and resolve. The shogunate attempted to respond with its own reforms. It established naval training schools, imported weapons from Europe, and sent envoys abroad. But these efforts came too late and were too limited to stem the tide of discontent. The Bakufu, as the shogunal administration was known, had lost the confidence of the people and the allegiance of many of its own vassals. The tipping point came in the late 1860s. In 1867, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, the 15th shogun, formally resigned his post and returned governing power to the emperor in Kyoto. His action was intended as a political maneuver to preserve influence under a new constitutional framework. However, it quickly spiraled beyond his control. In early 1868, loyalist forces from the Satsuma and Choshu domains marched on Kyoto and declared the restoration of imperial rule. Tokugawa supporters resisted, and fighting broke out in what became known as the Boshin War. Over the course of the following year, the imperial forces advanced steadily, defeating Tokugawa loyalists and capturing Edo, which was then renamed Tokyo. By the middle of 1869, the Tokugawa Shogunate had been formally abolished. Power now rested with a new government under the restored Emperor Meiji. Though the emperor himself remained largely symbolic, the Meiji Restoration ushered in sweeping reforms aimed at modernizing Japan's political, economic, and military institutions. Central to these reforms was the dismantling of the feudal system and the creation of a modern nation-state. For the samurai, these changes were both shocking and irreversible. The hereditary privileges they had long enjoyed were now questioned. Their stipends were converted into government bonds. Their right to carry swords, their most visible symbol of status, was gradually restricted. The class itself was not immediately abolished, but its days were clearly numbered. Yet even as the world around them changed, many samurai remained active in the shaping of modern Japan. They staffed the new military academies, joined government ministries, and led diplomatic missions abroad. Their values of loyalty, discipline, and service were reframed as virtues for the new era. In some ways, the Meiji government relied on samurai ethos even as it dismantled the class structure that had sustained it. The arrival of Commodore Perry and the subsequent opening of Japan had done more than end isolation. It had forced the nation to confront the limits of its traditions and the necessity of change. For the samurai, it was a moment of existential crisis, a test of whether their identity could survive in a world no longer ruled by the sword. The Meiji Restoration, launched in the year 1868, was far more than a political shift from shogunate to imperial governance. It marked the beginning of a revolutionary transformation in every corner of Japanese society: political, economic, military, and cultural. In the process of constructing a modern nation-state, the Meiji leadership systematically dismantled the feudal order that had defined Japan for centuries. At the heart of that order stood the samurai. For centuries, the samurai had been the ruling class of Japan, first as warriors, then as administrators, and finally as moral exemplars during the Tokugawa peace. But the Restoration aimed to replace the old with the new: centralized bureaucracy instead of feudal domains, industrial capitalism in place of hereditary stipends, and a conscripted national army instead of a warrior caste. In this vision of progress, the samurai no longer had a place. The new government, though formally operating under the restored authority of Emperor Meiji, was led largely by samurai reformers from the domains of Satsuma, Choshu, Tosa, and Heian, many of whom had helped bring down the Tokugawa Shogunate. Their goal was to preserve national independence by adopting the tools of Western modernity: technology, science, legal codes, and military systems. But to do so, they had to sweep away the very institutions that had nurtured their own class. One of the first steps was administrative unification. The old domains were gradually replaced with a prefectural system, stripping regional daimyo of their political power. Most daimyo were persuaded or pressured to return their lands and authority to the emperor in what was known as the Hanseki Hokan. In return, they were given ceremonial positions and allowed to retain wealth, but the feudal structure was gone. The government then turned its attention to the samurai class. Samurai stipends, long a financial burden on the state, were first converted into bonds and then gradually eliminated. Many samurai resisted this change, as the stipends were their main source of income and their hereditary right. But the government framed the reform as a necessary sacrifice for national unity and economic modernization. Perhaps the most symbolic and traumatic reform came in the year 1876, when the government banned the wearing of swords in public. This edict, known as the Heian, stripped the samurai of their most visible symbol. While the law applied to all classes, its significance for the samurai was immense. For centuries, the two-sword style had defined their social status and personal identity. The sword was not merely a weapon, it was a moral and cultural emblem. Losing it was like losing a part of the soul. Alongside these measures came the creation of a modern national army. In the year 1873, the government introduced universal military conscription. All able-bodied male citizens were required to serve in the army, regardless of class. The new military was trained in Western tactics, wore uniforms rather than armor, and used rifles instead of swords. The samurai monopoly on military service had ended. These sweeping changes provoked a deep sense of betrayal and dislocation among many former samurai. Some adapted, becoming civil servants, educators, or businessmen in the new order. Others found employment in the imperial military or police forces. But for a significant number, especially those from lower ranks or economically struggling families, the loss of status and income was devastating. The discontent led to a series of samurai-led rebellions during the early years of the Meiji period. The most famous and consequential of these was the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, led by Saigo Takamori, a former Meiji leader and a legendary figure of samurai virtue. Saigo had initially supported the Restoration and held high office in the early Meiji government. But he became increasingly disillusioned with the direction of reform, particularly the abandonment of samurai values and the perceived erosion of moral leadership. He also opposed the government's decision to forego military expansion into Korea, seeing it as a failure to assert Japanese strength. When tensions escalated in his home domain of Satsuma, where many samurai were angry over the loss of their privileges, Saigo resigned from government service and returned to Kagoshima. There, he established a private military academy that became a rallying point for dissatisfied warriors. In the spring of 1877, hostilities broke out between Saigo's forces and the imperial army. The rebellion, though valiant, was doomed. The imperial army, equipped with modern weapons and trained in Western tactics, vastly outnumbered the rebels. Over several months of fighting, Saigo's forces were pushed back, and many of his followers surrendered or were killed. The final battle took place at Shiroyama, where Saigo, wounded and surrounded, is believed to have taken his own life, though the exact circumstances remain debated. The defeat of the Satsuma Rebellion effectively ended samurai resistance to the Meiji reforms. It was the last major stand of the warrior class, and its failure symbolized the end of an era. In the years that followed, the government continued its project of modernization, expanding industry, building railways, and sending students abroad to study Western sciences. For the samurai, their transformation was complete. No longer warriors, they were absorbed into the modern Japanese state as civilians. Some became entrepreneurs, using their education and discipline to lead in industry and commerce. Others became academics, journalists, or politicians. Their values of loyalty, perseverance, and public service were repurposed to fit the new national ideology. Yet, even as the samurai class disappeared as a legal category, their memory persisted. Literature, theater, and eventually film began to romanticize the lost world of swords and honor. Figures like Saigo Takamori were reimagined as tragic heroes, noble resistors to modernity rather than relics of a bygone system. The idea of Bushido was revived, not as a class ethic, but as a national ideal. The Meiji government itself helped shape this memory. As Japan confronted the pressures of Western imperialism and sought to define its place in the world, the virtues associated with the samurai, discipline, sacrifice, loyalty to the state, were adapted to serve the needs of a modernizing empire. The samurai had been abolished, but the idea of the samurai was far from dead. With the formal abolition of the samurai class during the Meiji period and the end of hereditary warrior privileges, the samurai seemed to fade into history. But in truth, they did not vanish. They were transformed. In the decades and centuries that followed, the figure of the samurai would be reinterpreted, reimagined, and redeployed to serve new cultural, political, and ideological purposes. The samurai became not just a historical memory, but a national symbol, one that continues to shape Japanese identity even in a world far removed from the age of swords and armor. In the early 20th century, as Japan industrialized and expanded its empire, samurai values were incorporated into national education, military training, and political discourse. Government officials, military officers, and intellectuals drew on the idealized version of Bushido, the so-called Way of the Warrior, as a moral framework for modern citizenship and military service. Loyalty, sacrifice, obedience, and readiness to die for a higher cause were emphasized in schools and military academies, often without the nuance or context of the samurai's historical evolution. This use of Bushido reached its most aggressive form during the Second World War, when state propaganda promoted a version of samurai ethics to justify militarism, hierarchy, and national self-sacrifice. Kamikaze pilots were told they were following in the footsteps of samurai who had embraced death with honor. Soldiers were taught to fight to the end, to never surrender, and to value duty over life itself. But this wartime ideology bore only a partial resemblance to the samurai tradition. It simplified and instrumentalized complex values for political ends. Many aspects of real samurai history, such as internal conflict, individual ambition, philosophical diversity, and cultural expression, were omitted or suppressed. In the aftermath of Japan's defeat in 1945, this version of the samurai was largely discredited. Yet the deeper legacy remained. In the post-war decades, the samurai were reborn again, this time not as tools of state power, but as cultural icons. Literature, film, television, and popular media embraced the samurai as figures of personal integrity, stoic discipline, and moral clarity. Directors such as Kurosawa Akira brought to life stories that emphasized the inner struggles and ethical choices of the samurai, not just their battlefield heroics. Films like Seven Samurai and Harakiri presented complex portraits of warriors caught between ideals and reality, duty and compassion. Outside Japan, the samurai became a symbol of Japanese uniqueness and tradition. From martial arts dojos to corporate seminars, the language of Bushido was adopted in contexts far removed from its origins. In business culture, the samurai ethos was sometimes invoked to promote perseverance, group loyalty, and personal sacrifice for organizational goals. In global popular culture, samurai were romanticized alongside knights and cowboys, figures who embodied a disciplined individualism shaped by a code of honor. Today, the influence of the samurai is felt in many layers of Japanese life. Museums preserve their armor and weapons. Schools still teach their history. Tourists visit castles and battlefields. Cultural festivals celebrate their legacy with reenactments, parades, and sword demonstrations. But more subtly, the values once associated with the samurai, discipline, loyalty, social responsibility, continue to resonate in contemporary Japanese norms, even as the society itself becomes more modern, urban, and globally connected. What, then, is the enduring legacy of the samurai? The story of the samurai is not a straight line from battlefield to museum. It is a layered history of transformation. From provincial warriors to national rulers, from sword-bearing elites to civil administrators, from abolition to cultural myth, the samurai have adapted to changing times, even after their institutional demise. Their legacy reminds us that identity is not fixed, that tradition can be both preserved and repurposed, and that even the most iconic figures in history are shaped by the forces around them. The samurai were never just warriors. They were also poets, monks, philosophers, reformers, and in some cases, rebels. Their values were not monolithic, but debated, lived, and redefined over centuries. Their decline was not sudden, but gradual, shaped by social, economic, and political shifts far beyond the battlefield. And their memory today is not merely nostalgic, but part of an ongoing conversation about what it means to live with purpose, responsibility, and conviction in a changing world. In the end, the samurai are not just a chapter in Japan's past. They are part of its continuing story, reflected in its values, its culture, and its search for identity in the modern age. This concludes the story of the samurai, their rise, their transformation, and their legacy. A history forged in steel, tempered by peace, and carried forward not only in weapons and armor, but in the memory of a nation.